In this presentation, we will take a look at the employee or payroll section. Time to turn the page with Sage 50 Cloud Accounting. Here we are in our practice file for Bellwether Garden and Supplies. You should be able to follow along with this in the demo version. We're in the actual version of the software within the demo file within it, but you should be able to follow along with the free demo version. We're down here in the employees and payroll. Employees and payroll, we want to consider the flowchart with relation to payroll. Now note that payroll is typically going to be another system into itself in that we've taken a look at these different types of segments of the business, breaking it down to the customers, the vendors, and so on and so forth. And those are areas where, different departments can be. We can have whole departments working in those areas. The same is true for payroll. Payroll is obviously quite complex, getting more complex all the time. You typically need to add more features in order to run the payroll. In other words, pay more for add-ons for the help of running the payroll within the system. And there's a lot of interplay within the processing of payroll in terms of the forms of payroll, as well as human resources kind of departments and that kind of activity for hiring and firing and relations type of activities as well. So there's a lot of overlap with payroll. Can be kind of a specialty type of field and touch on some of those other kind of areas like a human resources type of area. We're going to be thinking here, of course, at the data input with regards to payroll, the processing of the payroll. Typical flow with regards to the processing of payroll is, well, of course, we're going to have the payroll need to be set up. We're going to have all the employees set up with regards to the payroll. We're going to need the payroll to be set up in the system properly. What's going to be the payroll system within that we're going to be running? And that'll be including things like, do we pay monthly? Do we pay semi-monthly? Do we pay bi-weekly or weekly? Do we typically got to set up the salary or, how we're going to pay people, how often we're going to pay people, when is the cutoff date, when do we actually process the checks after the end of the payroll process? So all that kind of information we need to have within the system. Then we need to just process the payroll, and that typically would be we're going to pay the employees, recording the actual process of the payment of the employees. Now notice when you go through the pay employees process, there's going to be multiple accounts that will be affected. If it weren't for kind of the laws that are going to be included with regards to withholdings, payroll would be a very simple thing. We would just basically increase the payroll expense and credit the liability. But obviously, we have the withholdings that we're going to have to deal with. So these are going to be things that we're going to need to process with the paying of the payroll. Now, when we process the payroll, we could have direct deposit information for the payroll, and we could have actual checks that we're going to need to process for the payroll. So if we went into the pay payroll items, we can set up payroll service, enter payroll for one employee, enter payroll for multiple employees. This would typically be the process if we're running the monthly payroll activities. If I was to select OK and go through this process, then you could see the basically payroll process that we could start to input. I won't actually process through the payroll period here, but notice we have the check date and the pay in date. These don't necessarily have to be on the same date. It just depends again how we're going to be setting up our payroll process. Once we pay the payroll, I'm going to close this out and I'm going to say, you have employees, do you want to print these checks? I'm going to say no. Once we pay the payroll or once we process the payroll, the typical kind of journal entry that's going to happen is that we're going to have the expense for the journal entry that's going to happen, increase in the expense, but the expense is going to be for the gross pay, not the net check. The checking account's going to go down by the amount that we have either through direct deposits or the printing of the check, but it's going to go down by the net check. And then all the withholdings that we had to put in place, which include federal income tax, Social Security, Medicare, and then any other kind of personal withholdings like health insurance and that kind of stuff, 401k plan and whatnot, would have to be removed and put into a liability account as well. So again, the actual calculation or the number of accounts that could be affected are quite complex. Also note that when you're dealing with payroll, you also need to provide that information to the employees, and we need to provide them not only with the net check, but what they earned on the gross pay and all that withholdings from them, not only for that particular check, but also from a year-to-date standpoint. So that's a lot of information that again, the payroll department can be quite inclusive department or have a lot of components to it. Typically often includes, paying extra for the payroll services within the software as well, and or many companies will opt for an outside service to help with the payroll, possibly an ADP or Paychex type of thing. Let's just consider the reports real quick. I'm going to go to the reporting drop down. We're going to go to our financial statements. Let's open up that balance sheet. And I'm going to keep it at the current period. So I'm going to open this up. And so here we have it. Now, again, when we process the payroll, of course, the checking account would be decreasing by the net check that would happen. And then the other side is going to go to the expense account, which is going to be the payroll expense. Then we're also going to have what was taken out of the paycheck. And that it could include things such as a 401k check might be taken out. The health insurance might be taken out of paychecks that would then be liability accounts. Federal payroll taxes payable. These are liability accounts, FUTA. Now, and then we have our portion of the payroll taxes, which include things like the FUTA, Federal Unemployment Tax Act, and then state payroll taxes and SUTA. This is all related to the payroll, right? And then local payroll tax payable, and so on. So all of that information is kind of some of the withholdings. And again, it's one of the most complex kind of journal entries you have. For typically accounting, because multiple accounts are going to be affected, and the number of detail you're going to have with the number of employees also makes it something complex. And of course, the requirements with regards to reporting that information to the employees, how you're going to report it, pay stub, and so on, by check and by year-to-date information can make payroll, again, quite complex and a specialty type of area. So then if we go to the income statement, if I go on into the income statement, and I'm going to say I don't want to see the zero accounts, and say OK, and then we scroll on through to the income statement. Let's scroll down through the income statement. We should have the payroll tax and the office expense. So note that we could be breaking out the payroll as well to different kind of components. So if we might have the office payroll, the selling and admin payroll. If we're producing things, we may have payroll applied to the cost of goods sold in some type of way. And also note that the expense here will typically be on the gross pay. So if we're talking about a payroll expense, that will typically be the gross pay, not the net check. And that then we have the payroll tax expense, and the payroll tax expense will be the employer portion of the payroll. So the payroll tax expense does not typically include the employee taxes, the withholdings. They include the employer tax, Social Security, and Medicare, and the and any other employer taxes like the federal unemployment tax. So this is actually the payroll tax, and then the payroll expenses down here. So in wages, and again, you could call it payroll expense, you might call it wages, you might break out that wages to multiple different accounts because you want to track it in different kind of areas. If we go into it, then we have the actual checks, and again, there's a lot of detail in here because note, we're breaking out each of these by multiple different checks. You can kind of think of payroll as if it's one giant journal entry, like as if you had one employee that you're paying. But obviously, when you break it down to the information you have to provide to the employees, you're going to have multiple checks. Those multiple checks are also the things that are going to be clearing the bank in terms of the net check. So you want to be able to reconcile that information to the bank. If we then double click on one of these items, we're going to go to the data input form. So here's going to be the data input form. For this check, we have the regular pay, regular hours, overtime hours, the check amount at the 320, and then we've got the withholdings that include the federal income tax, the Social Security, the Medicare, the state, and so on and so forth. And if I keep on scrolling back down here, then we see some more for the employer portion of taxes, which is the Social Security, Medicare employer portion, FUTA, the employer portion, and so on and so forth. So in other words, you got the gross pay in this case was the 380. Then you had to take out all of the stuff that was withheld from the check, which includes all this information up top. And that brings to 380. It should bring it down to the net check. And then you also have the employer information that the employer is going to have to pay over and above, which includes this information down below. So I'm going to close this back out. So, and then of course the liability accounts that we have over here in the future at some point in time, we'll have to actually pay off all the withholdings that we had for the payroll taxes. So let's go back into the balance sheet. Let's go to the balance sheet. So all these liabilities at some future point in time, then of course we'll have to pay them off. So we withheld from the employee the payroll taxes, and we had to pay our portion of the payroll taxes, and we put them into a liability at the point in time we processed payroll. Then of course we're gonna have to pay those at some future point in time. So that's just kind of an overview of the payroll. we're not gonna dive into the depth of payroll that we would like to in terms of processing the payroll, because again, a lot of companies will opt for different options of payroll. Payroll is kind of a specialty area in of itself. Often involves an added feature or cost to be tracking the payroll within the software, and even still, many small to mid-sized companies and larger companies even will opt for a third-party payroll option such as an ADP or Paycheck. So we'll touch on payroll, but just note that again, payroll's it's kind of a specialty area in and of itself. So that's going to be it for now. Let's get out of here.